Hey everyone, it's Jamie. So the federal leaders will face off tonight, Thursday, in the only English language debate. We're going to have a wrap of that for you tomorrow morning. I hope you'll tune in. But before then, we thought it would be useful to take a look at where this whole campaign sits right now. What are people across the country thinking? Is anything shifting? How do they feel about the leaders at this moment? Where are the parties drawing their biggest support and losses from? David Coletto is here with me to do that. David, hey.
Hi, Jamie. How you doing?
I'm great. It's great to have you. David is, of course, the CEO of the polling firm, Abacus Data. He is a regular on this show. And I should say that he will also be joining us for our live stream on election night, along with a bunch of other great people. Alameen Abdul Mahmood is going to be there from Commotion, Tom Power from Q, Nala Ayed from Ideas. We are going to talk about politics for 4 hours. And I actually think it's going to be fun. I think it's going to be fun.
I can't wait. I can't think of a better group of people to hang out with for 4 hours while we watch these results. So looking forward to it, Jamie.
Yeah, me too. And I hope that you guys will all tune in. You can find it on the CBC News YouTube channel, on CBC News TikTok. But right now, let's talk about what the polls are telling us. Hey, David, why don't we start with the race? At the moment, what does your latest polling tell you about what the outcome is looking to be on April 28th?
Yeah, so we came out with a survey yesterday that shows the gap tightening, and a number of other polls are showing the same thing. But the conclusion is still the same, which is the Liberals still have an advantage. You know, if the election were today, I think they would be very much likely to win it, even if their vote share nationally is in decline or tightening, and there's some indication that's happening. Their advantages in certain parts of the country are just so great that it means they would win most seats. So I would say today, still advantage Liberal, but there's indications that maybe some people are shifting, or at least still open-minded about how they're going to vote when they do, either this weekend or, as you said, on April 28th.
Has anybody calculated the odds, right? Like the odds of a Liberal majority or a Liberal minority, or the odds of the Conservatives winning the most seats?
Yeah, well, I mean, the CBC's poll tracker, Eric Grenier, has been doing that for a while, and he suggests that there's an 85% probability the Liberals are going to win a majority government based on the polls that we have today. And there's only a 2% probability that the Conservatives will win the most seats. So basically a 98% chance that the Liberals are going to likely form government. Whether it's a majority or minority is still, I guess, somewhat up in the air. But, you know, if you're a betting person, those odds suggest that a Liberal majority is what the numbers are telling us is going to happen if, again, that election were today.
Yeah. People are betting, right, on Polymarket, and it is similar, the odds there.
It's similar,
well.
Yeah. It's pretty strong odds for Carney and the Liberals.
Okay, so this projected Liberal win, I just want to talk about how much of it is because of the collapse we are seeing from the NDP. How much of it is the Bloc shedding votes in Quebec, and how much of it is the Conservatives losing votes to the Liberals? Let me put this question another way. Of those three trends that we know are all happening, what is the most significant one?
I think the most significant is the NDP decline. That for most of the last 4 or 5 years, our polling, other polling has shown them anywhere between 18 and 20% in national polls. And today their average is about 8%. So that's a 10 percentage point drop. That's more than half of their vote has gone somewhere else. And we know from our polls, when we ask people, you know, how did you vote last time and where are you voting now? More than half has left that NDP support, and it's going mostly to the Liberals. And so I think a big part of that is the NDP drop. But one of the reasons why the Liberals are why the odds are so good for them to win a majority is because they are also doing quite well in Quebec. I mean, the poll tracker that Eric does has, you know, the Liberals ahead by almost 20 percentage points on average in Quebec. They would win, you know, a substantial number of seats and pick up quite a few, significantly more than they did in the last 2 federal elections. And so you take that NDP drop, you take the softening of the Bloc support in Quebec, and that alone is enough to give the Liberals a victory. You know, and that's happening even though the Conservative vote is actually higher than it was than the last 2 elections. a lot of the commentary out there has been, and you see the Conservatives fighting amongst each other that they've run a bad campaign, that this, and there perhaps is some truth to that because the circumstances of this election changed, and there may be some who believe that the Conservatives haven't adapted to it. But Pierre Poilievre personally is not, and at least in Abacus polling, deeply unpopular. There's 40% of Canadians who have a positive view of him, which would normally be enough for a Conservative to win a majority. Stephen Harper only got 40% of the vote in 2011. But when those other two circumstances we talked about, a collapsing NDP vote and to some extent a Green Party that's only going to run candidates at just over 200 seats and have seen their support drop, as well as the Bloc, most of that going to the Liberals gives them a place where they're in their low 40s, and that's going to be enough for them to win a majority if it doesn't change.
David, I remember doing an episode about the polls with you right before the U.S. election, and I know you were not sure who was going to win. You said the polls were too close to say with any confidence, but I think I made you do it. And you came to the conclusion that you were leaning Kamala, right? I'm not trying to rub it in here. I'm not trying to rub it in here.
Rub it in. It's okay.
But one thing I have heard repeatedly through this election is that when it comes to predicting outcomes, Canadian polling does a better job than American polling. And I wonder if you could explain that to me. Is that about the way that we do our polling, or is that about the way that our elections work?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. In the U.S. election, historically anyways, turnout's been lower. I mean, Canada has actually, even though our turnout's gone down in the last few elections, it still has been higher. In the U.S. election, the opposite's true. They've had a real surge in voter turnout because the stakes for many Americans became higher. That was a very close elections, the last number of them. And so people really got engaged. And so I think for pollsters in the U.S., and I can't speak for them, but I think it's harder, and it's so close that, literally, 100,000 votes out of hundreds of millions cast could be the difference between one person winning the presidency and one person not. Now in Canada, I mean, at the federal level, the polls have been actually very good over the entire time I've been doing polling. You can go back to 2004 when I started doing some polling for Nick Nanos. And I don't know if it's because it's easier to do here or we're doing anything differently, but I think that for whatever reason, we have the ability to kind of better estimate how people are going to vote and whether they come out and vote at all. And I think that's really important. And it's going to be an important factor in this election, right? If the polls are wrong on the 28th, it's because we probably underestimated either the Conservatives in terms of their motivation. We miss them. And the polls in the past have generally underestimated Conservatives, even in Canada. I went back and I looked at all the polls in the last two elections. And for many pollsters, we underestimated Conservative vote share by 2 to 3 points. I still think that could happen here, which is why I think, you look at Abacus's polls versus some of the others, we have a smaller Liberal lead. There's a cautiousness built into my methodology that says, I think we're underrepresenting Conservatives. They just are less likely to participate in surveys. But we know they're just as motivated to vote. In fact, in some cases, maybe more so. So those are the kinds of things I'm looking for. But Ontario election, Nova Scotia elections we just had provincially, the polls did very well. So I'm confident that the methodologies that we are using are capturing things. But voters, as I like to say, people are unpredictable because until they actually go and vote, and we know that about a third of people sometimes say they're not making up their mind until they actually step into that voting place.
Right.
They could always do something they didn't tell us they were going to do.
So with that in mind, though, I want to dig a bit deeper into intentions. Why don't we start with a geographic survey, right? You mentioned before Quebec, but what else are you seeing across the country? Any big surprises?
Yeah, I think there are some, right? I mean, in British Columbia is one I watch carefully because it's a province that not that long ago was overwhelmingly conservative, had supported the Reform Party in the 90s and continued to support the Alliance as it changed. For listeners who need a little bit of a history lesson of the evolution of the conservative movement in Canada. But in December of 2024, just a few weeks before Justin Trudeau announced his resignation, the Liberal Party was polling at like 12% in British Columbia in our survey in that month. And today they're at, on average, 42. So almost a 4 times increase in their support in British Columbia is really interesting, right? And I think we'll talk demographics a little bit, but one of the sub-stories that's tied to region is that because the Liberals are doing particularly well among baby boomers, parts of the country where there are higher concentrations of seniors, for example, think of places like Kelowna, British Columbia, or Victoria, because they have strength among that demographic.
Yeah.
I think there are parts of this country that are now in play that wouldn't have been. And BC is one of them. I'll just say, we talked about Quebec. Ontario is often where, to the annoyance of every other Canadian outside of Ontario, where this thing will turn. And as of right now, the Liberals are ahead by 7 in our poll, 10 on average, and that's better than they did in 2021.
Right.
So the Conservatives cannot win if the Liberals are winning by 10 points in Ontario.
Very seat-rich GTA region is essentially what when we do the live stream, we're really going to be watching that as it comes in. Do demographics for me a little bit more here. So boomers, why are they gravitating so much to the Liberals? And then other demographics groups that you're finding really interesting.
Yeah, so boomers have been, again, we talked about this before, but I think it's the most interesting demographic in terms of how rapidly they shifted towards the Liberals, both because I think of Trump and them being the most angry and feeling betrayed by what Trump has done and said, whether it's tariffs or whether it's 51st state rhetoric. All of that has basically galvanized boomers to embrace the Liberals, and particularly Mark Carney. I think Mark Carney is very appealing to baby boomers. He gives them a sense of security and safety and competence that I think they're really looking for, right? Like, if this election is often being framed around like stability versus change or stability versus disruption, Mark Carney is the ultimate stability, calm focal point for people, and boomers are particularly looking for that. On the flip side, I think younger Canadians, whether they're, we talk about Gen Z or millennials, I think they are looking at this in a different lens. They are not happy with the state of the world. No one's really happy with it, but they're still focused on the here and now. I can't pay my rent or mortgage. My kids, the cost of food continues to go up, as we heard this week from Stats Canada, and they're looking for more immediate relief. They're less concerned about the existential crisis that Canada might be under. Not to say that those things aren't creating more insecurities, but they are still, I think, a little bit bruised by the Trudeau government, and so have been less open to embracing Mark Carney. And there's still a lot of affinity, particularly among younger men, but generally among younger people, towards Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives.
I want to dig into young men with you. This is a trend that we have seen around much of the Western world, in Germany, in the US, of young men feeling disenfranchised in some way and lurching to the right. And just what extent has that happened here compared to what we've seen elsewhere? I
think it's happened almost to the same extent. How does it actually play itself out into political behavior? I think we'll see. But there is evidence in surveys that we've been doing going back a number of years now that young men are kind of deviating from where the rest of the country is. And in fact, the biggest gender gaps we see on a lot of attitudinal questions, how they feel about the economy, social structures, and politics, that gender gap is the widest among Canadians under 30. You can almost say that like young men are moving in one direction and young women are moving in the other. And that is similar to what we saw in Germany. It's similar to what we've seen in the United States around Trump.
Yeah.
That young men, I think in particular, particularly white young men, are looking for like disruptors, right? They have this feeling that the systems in place have completely left them behind and made it hard for them to achieve things they thought they could. And so if someone like Pierre Poilievre, I think, is speaking directly to a breaking down, getting rid of gatekeepers, smashing institutions that they think are just working against them. And we see that a lot in the data.
But look, I'm looking at a chart right now from Angus Reid, the polling from Angus Reid, released late March. And it has males aged 18 to 34 at 33% conservative and 42% liberal. So they're leading by almost 10 points. How would you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, different pollsters are seeing different things. And when you get into, if we're getting technical, your sample sizes, there might be some differences. I see in my data consistent difference, though, where the number one predictor of someone voting conservative for much of the last few months is being a male under 30. So in my data, I'm seeing it consistently. And then the piece that your colleague Jonathan Montpetit did for the National went back to Canadian election studies, right? Big academic studies going back to the early 2000s. And they have shown a divergence in some key attitudes between young men and young women over time as well. So I wouldn't get caught up on one poll being slightly different, and instead look at the trends that are happening. And why is it that a lot of young men are saying, I like Pierre Poilievre, he's engaging and connecting with me in a way that young women are not saying about him. In fact, are kind of repelled by Pierre Poilievre.
Any other interesting demographic data you think is worth us discussing? Education, maybe?
Education's a really interesting one, right? For much of the last 2 years, when the Conservatives were ahead by 20 points, the level of education you have, university, college, lower levels of formal education, almost disappeared as a variable because the Conservative lead was so big. But I think today we're seeing it reemerge as one of the key predictors or separators of the electorate. So if you have a university education in Canada right now, you are the most likely to be voting Liberal of those three education groups. And if you have lower levels of formal education, say high school, you are the least likely to vote Liberal. So this whole boots not suits framing that Pierre Poilievre has been using is showing up in the data. And there's an interesting, I think, it's professional and education and class all built into one, and we're seeing evidence of it. So Mark Carney, the guy with the PhD, went to Harvard, went to Oxford. He is right now the leader for those with a university degree. Pierre Poilievre is still far more appealing to people who, work with their hands for a living or don't sit at a desk all day.
Before we move on to the debates, I do want to ask you a little bit more about the leaders themselves, particularly the two frontrunners, Carney and Poilievre. I've heard people talk about how Carney is polling ahead of his party and Poilievre is polling behind it. And just explain that to me.
Yeah, what that basically means is when you look at how people say they would vote, and then you ask them questions like, how do you feel about the leaders? You are seeing some deviation, that there are people who say, I like Mark Carney more than I might like the Liberal Party, and I like the Conservative Party maybe more than I like Pierre Poilievre. And these are these internal tensions that pull people to their decision on who they might vote for. In the case of Mark Carney, there is clear evidence, although perhaps in our most recent survey that might be somewhat shifting, but he's still the most popular federal party leader. More than 45% or so of Canadians have a positive view of him. So there are more people who say, I like Mark Carney than are willing right now to vote Liberal. And so I think not enough credit is actually given to Mr. Carney and how well he's helped the Liberal Party get to where it is in a position of strength right now. For Mr. Poilievre, it's somewhat of the reverse, although perhaps not as big a factor, in that there are people who are probably going to vote Conservative who aren't thrilled that Mr. Poilievre is the leader, but are doing it because they still want a change in government. But I think in both cases, one of the so far interesting features of this campaign is just how among the voters that are going to vote for these parties feel about the leaders. I went back and looked at previous elections that we've done polling in, and both Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Carney are more well-liked by more people than any of the other leaders going back to the Trudeau era beginning. And I think that's an interesting dynamic about the times we're in and the importance of leadership in this election. This isn't really a policy debate election, but I think what Canadians are looking for is the kind of leader they want. And again, I mentioned earlier, like disruption versus stability, change versus, strength to stand up to Trump. And I think both of these leaders are offering something very different to different segments of the electorate. And that's why it's still a relatively close election, even if the Liberals structurally have an advantage.
Now that we have a better sense of where the parties are weak and where they are strong, let's talk about how that all might map onto the issues that we're going to hear them talk about. The French debate will have already happened by the time that people listen to this, but these are the topics for the English debate tonight. They're pretty similar. Affordability and the cost of living, energy and climate, leading in a crisis, public safety and security, tariffs and threats to Canada. And so what do the frontrunners especially need to do on these topics, given what you and I have just been talking about? Let's start with Carney.
Yeah, I think Mark Carney's biggest vulnerability is Justin Trudeau. And so I think he will be under attack by all the party leaders, frankly, about how similar he is to Trudeau in terms of a lot of the policy. And so for him, I think, affordability is going to be the one that Mr. Poilievre in particular, but also Mr. Singh are really going to try to hammer him on and to make the case that, yes, while he's getting credit for getting rid of the carbon tax, that fundamentally under the past Liberal government, life just became so unaffordable to people. Housing became so far out of reach, and that you can't really trust the Liberals to do anything on that going forward. So for Mr. Carney, that's his liability. His strength, though, is any conversation around Trump and the economy more broadly. And so he will hope to lean in on that for sure.
Poilievre?
I think Poilievre's the reverse, frankly. His strengths are affordability, housing. He's still seen as best able to do those in our polling than Mark Carney. But when it comes to dealing with Trump, among people who care about that issue, he's trailing by a significant margin over Mark Carney. I think the biggest thing that people are going to be watching for also is, is he Trumpy or not, right? Does he reflect the kind of language that so many, particularly baby boomers, as we discussed earlier, are not interested in hearing? And can he appear to be that safe harbor that about half the country is looking for, while at the same time still appealing to those who want disruption and change? And so that's a very challenging balance, I think, for Mr. Poilievre to be able to do. But I think he has to do it if he wants to win this election.
Mm-hmm. David, we've talked about how the vote has been shifting somewhat in these final weeks, but I'm just curious, we're heading into a long weekend here. We're going to come out of the long weekend, and then it's less than a week before people vote on April 28th. Normally, at this point in a campaign, how locked in is the vote? And have you ever seen a debate move the vote as much as it would need to be moved in this kind of scenario?
So first, I think there's a softness still there, but it's hardening every day. And I think as after this debate too, not only are lots of family and friends getting together, but advance polls open up. So there's going to be millions of people who may actually go and cast their ballot this weekend. So it's a really important moment. Yeah. I think it's still up for grabs to some extent, but what has to happen for that to occur is people are going to tune in tonight with some first, second, third impressions that are either going to get confirmed or they're going to get kind of shaken up. And then what happens next, if you shake up that person who's like, I haven't made up my mind, I'm still weighing my options, but I have an inclination of what I might do, the conversations that come after, that's why this weekend is actually so important, could be the thing that solidifies people, right? Because oftentimes you're either going to get in a fight with your family over politics, or the conversation's going to confirm the things that you all are thinking about. So in the past, debates have mattered, but not to the extent that I think they need to if the Conservatives are going to put themselves in a place where they can win this election. Keep in mind that if the Conservatives are behind about, on average, 5 points right now nationally to the Liberals in all the polls that we've seen, to win an election, to win a majority, they're going to have to beat the Liberals by 5 or 6 points. So that's a 10-point swing in the polls that I don't think has happened in Canadian elections. So I'm still skeptical that unless something, again, catastrophic happens to one of the leaders tonight, I don't suspect that it's going to have a huge effect on the vote enough to fundamentally shift things.
Right. Although I hadn't thought about what you just said about the long weekend and how everybody's going to go see their families. And you're right. That will be a significant thing that's going to be happening across the country, whether people go and fight with their families or not about politics. Okay. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it as always.
My pleasure. We'll see you election night.
All right, that is all for today. I'm Jamie Poisson. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you all tomorrow.